Was
We're
that?
not streaming.
We're not streaming?
Yeah, like tons of people are saying hi, but like it's not streaming for us
Let
for
me
a
see.
reason. It's not you. It's
No, I see.
yeah, it's
No, it's waiting for this.media, actually.
I know, and I don't know.
Let me actually stop sharing for a second.
I know. It says it's live. Okay. Weird. Okay, so now it's working. I don't know what happened, but now it's working. Hi, y'all. Poor Juri. He's been like giving this talk and it's been awesome.
I think we just have a huge delay, probably.
I know. Well, I mean, that was totally weird. So, okay, now it's working. So, that's never happened on StreamYard before, but I guess we should say welcome again. Hi, guys. Welcome. Yeah. It's funny because once you stop, yeah, we'll just totally restart the whole thing. So welcome to, hold on a second, let me just fix my camera really quickly. Welcome everyone to Angular World Tour. This is basically in partnership with Angular San Francisco, Angular Mountain View, GDG Silicon Valley, and Modern Web. I'm so excited that we're here today, especially since I feel like all of us have been dying to get back to Google offices to have some amazing meetups. But, you know, unfortunately right now, we are still not able to do that. So we're kicking off Angular World Tour for the rest of the year, visiting SF and Mountain View. So I'm so excited to see some folks in here from Cupertino and Redwood City and everywhere. You know, obviously also great to see Lance. I gave you a shout out earlier, Lance, but like apparently we weren't screaming. So, you know, great to see Tan and Liz and everybody here from the Bay Area. Hopefully we will have local, hopefully we'll have some more like local meetups soon. But for now, we're going to be doing this. So really excited to have two amazing speakers, Juri and Duncan, giving some amazing talks today. So do you guys want to do a quick, like, what will you be talking about? Maybe Juri go first since you'll be the first speaker, and then we'll give a summary of what Duncan will do and then kick it off to the talk.
Sure. Yeah, my talk will be mainly about architecting large-scale Angular apps with module federation. So we'll dig a bit into that and how specifically you can use NX with that, like how NX can help in that. But yeah, we'll mostly walk through the topic of scaling Angular applications.
Yeah, hi. Yes, I should be talking about Angular material, in particular the form field component and the options that are around that, really. It'll be a sort of like a bit of a demo. So, yeah.
Yeah, I'm super excited. Live coding / demoing is always a dangerous game to play, but always the most exciting too. So stay tuned. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and let Juri get started and go ahead and share your screen. Sorry, Juri, but at least we caught it early.
Yeah, not just like at the end of the talk, basically everyone saying, oh, doesn't look like we did this.
I know. It was so funny because I was seeing the views be 0, but then I saw so many people in the chat and I was like, oh, this is so great. So yeah, it's great to see everybody saying hi and everything like that. Juri, I think you're okay. Let me see. There we go. Okay, great.
Good.
Yes. Yep. There we go.
Awesome. All right. So as we mentioned earlier, or as I mentioned just basically in the intro, I'm going to talk about architecting large-scale Angular apps. For some, the module federation part here might seem a bit weird, but we're going to dive a bit into that topic and why module federation, specifically Webpack module federation, can help with that scaling aspect. So first of all, who am I? My name is Juri Strumpflohner. I'm the director of developer experience at Nrwl. I'm a Google developer expert in web tech and Angular, instructor at Egghead, and also Cypress ambassador. And for those that don't know about Nrwl or have never heard about it, Nrwl is the company behind NX. We provide consulting services to a lot of Fortune 500 companies. We're focusing mostly on Angular, React, and also monorepos. And as mentioned, we developed the open source kit NX, open source toolkit. And most recently, we also took over stewardship of Lerna, which is known to be like a JavaScript monorepo tool. So as mentioned, I will talk or I will mix in a lot of the NX stuff in this talk, although a lot of the concepts are basically general purpose. So I will mostly highlight how NX can help in that specific areas. And in general, we have to say that NX has seen tremendous growth in the last years. And we're super happy about that because it kind of confirms our mission. So if we take a look, for instance, in January 2022, we hit a big milestone, which is like 1 million downloads per week from NPM stats. And only 6 months later in June, end of June, we reached now 2 million downloads and we're heading upwards very, very quickly. So we're super glad and thankful for that and motivated to push that forward. But today we want to talk a bit about software architecture and the scaling aspect of it. So what is good software architecture? This might be a bit subjective, obviously, but like if we try to break it down, usually it boils down to 3 main areas, which is the maintainability aspect. There is the flexibility aspect, meaning like to be able to adjust quickly to business requirements and changing business requirements. And then there's the scalability aspect, which I want to focus mostly on today. And then if we open up the scalability part, I see mostly 2 aspects there. The one is basically the runtime scalability, which is all about how do we deploy the application? Do we have some sort of cluster setup that can scale up and scale down based on the amount of requests and traffic that we get? There's also the whole edge computing involved, obviously edge computation, where like whether like we want to deploy more near to our users and therefore reduce latency. So everything about how we run the application once we deploy it. There is, however, also the whole development time aspect to scalability, which can be things like how easy it is to allocate more teams to the same project. Because as mentioned, we might like start small, but then as our team grows, as our like application grows, we might want to add more and more teams, and we need to have the structure there to scale that. And that also involves local development. So things like how long does it take to do an ng serve? Is it like in the minutes or hopefully more in the seconds or milliseconds, which obviously impacts a lot our productivity. And as well, things like pull request, lead time, or like the mean time from a pull request from its first commit to when it lands in the main branch. Things like that are interesting to observe and play actually a major role also in scaling of software. And so we want to focus a bit on that time and on that part and how we can actually help optimize that. And so the first thing I want to like dive deeper is the code organization. It is not something people immediately consider when we talk about scaling, but it's actually pretty important, and it can lead to some quite interesting benefits. Now, this is usually what we get, what we see here on this slide from an Angular CLI setup, right? So we have one application being generated. Most of the folks follow the best practice that Angular team also gives, which is like the organization of different features, like the folder structure based on the domain areas or the features you develop within your application. And so the features, basically the folders here, basically serve as the feature boundaries of your application. And from the NX perspective, we could totally have the same, of course, like we could have the exact same setup with an app with the separation only in the folders. But what we usually recommend people to do is to actually split that up into a very thin application layer and very well-defined libraries. And it is important to say here, because many people have that misconception, when I talk about library or package here, it doesn't necessarily mean that package is generally reusable or super abstracted away, right? So these are libraries that are very specific for our application. So they represent some feature area and therefore most of the time just serve a single app. Now, obviously, as you can see here, there's a mention of a shared library, of a core library. Those are potentially reusable, of course, like they can, for instance, have like a shared UI component library, which you could potentially use across many applications, right? But that's not necessarily a requirement. And so that structure already helps us not only nicely define the boundaries, but we can also now very easily assign teams to that. So for instance, like we can assign core specific folks to just the course library here, and they work mostly isolated in that part, the sales and coupons and so on. And if we grow, we might even have dedicated infrastructure teams. Often those are also being taken care of by the similar domain teams. But it might make sense if you grow to have dedicated people to just have a look at that setup or make sure that the whole setup works nicely. And so at the top level, we have basically our applications, which is basically the deployables, and then the code lives in those libraries down there. And so we can have a quick look how that setup looks like, for instance, within an NX workspace. And so I have just created here already an example, which has one Angular application at the top here, has a bunch of libraries. Now, the cool thing is in NX, we can do something like NX graph. And so if I open that up here in the browser window, we can already explore what a structure looks like. And so you can see here we have that shop application, which has a checkout, orders, and product catalog feature, which is like these libraries down here. And we can also then explore how these are connected. And for instance, if I click up here, I can see this is actually connected because there's some import here in our shop application. We can see the main connection that we have here is a very loose one. So we just use the router to lazily import basically the single feature areas from our library. So you can see how thin that library or that application up here actually is, because it doesn't really contain anything like significant for the application itself. Most of the code is just imported lazily. And if you run this, it looks something like this. So let me quickly boot up here, local environment server. And so if I open this up on 4200, we see an application in here, right, which is just a very simple demo app where you could have a menu which then loads in lazily all those different feature areas. And so from a code perspective, the actual code then happens within the area itself. So for instance, here this loads the product catalog module. And so if I go in here, that single feature area has then its own routing structure, which then loads up all the single features that are being needed. It is also pretty interesting from the standpoint of like how such a library is being structured. This gives already a much stronger boundary than just a folder, because we can already see here we have all like the normal folder structure we might have also in our application, our classic Angular apps, but there's also an index.ts file, which is kind of our public API. And so already by this setup, every time I want to expose something, I have to explicitly do it here. And that already gives me a second moment to think about whether this is actually something that should be public or should be just private to this local library here. So you can already see how this might facilitate the overall architecture when we start building large applications. So as mentioned, and as we have...
I think your screen froze.
Where did I stop?
You're at the sharing your code and showing the project graph. But maybe if I remove and then share again, maybe.
Let me see.
Yeah, your internet blipped for a second. Is the audio video out of sync now, David? I think it's. Yuri, you want to stop sharing your screen real quick and then?
Sure.
Okay, and then we'll try again.
Let me actually go in here. Share the screen. Did it work?
Looks like it. Yep.
All right. So let me just continue from here, basically.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Also, as Juri is speaking, by the way, make sure to ask him questions in the chat. So if you have any questions as you're going, feel free to just ask in the YouTube comments.
Absolutely. All right. So we have briefly seen how libraries can basically give a better structure and a more like specific boundary or stronger boundary by having dedicated imports and exports. The main thing that I want to convey here as well is that the developer experience overall remains exactly the same. So we don't, even though like we split things up into like an application in different libraries, there's always still like a normal command nx serve shop or ng serve shop, which would be the same that which you would do with an Angular CLI application. So one thing, however, as our application grows that we might face are slow CI times. And that is something a lot of the folks that we work with also report us as the first thing, is that once the application gets bigger and bigger, the times on CI get larger and larger, and therefore, obviously, it hinders a lot of productivity overall. Now, the structure as we have proposed, like with an app and like a thin application, a lot of like different libraries can help with that as well. So it doesn't only help with team allocation, as we mentioned before, but we can also start reasoning about things such as only really run like the tests or lints of what actually changed, right? And so, for instance, if the sales project here changed, then also NX can figure out, for instance, that the application needs to be retested or relinted because that's the only dependency to that sales library there. Or another example would be if like some more lower library changes, like the shared library, then obviously more upstream parts like the courses and sales would also be tested. But you can already kind of guess or have a good intuition how we can potentially cut out a large chunk that we don't need to actually run on CI. And so in NX, you can do that with a specific command, which is affected and colon and whatever operation you run. So affected test, affected lint. And NX basically uses Git to understand, okay, like in this PR, how many commits are there and how does it differ from the main branch? And then it tries to figure out which projects are involved in those commits. And then obviously having those projects, it runs the commands in parallel on those projects. And so with that, we can already start optimizing. There's, however, a problem, and that is related to the actual build. And so what happens about the build itself, but also what happens, for instance, when we do the local NX serve or ng serve. That might still be quite a lot of time that is involved there. And the main reason for that is that the build still happens at the top level. So whenever we run something like NX build shop, it runs the build at the very top level. And the reason is because in those imports, sorry for jumping back, in those imports, we use these kind of npm scoped packages. So you can see that at mfdemo/product catalog. And that only works because there is at the root level a tsconfig base mapping, which maps those paths to the actual index.ts file. So what the build does, it actually pulls in all the sources into the application. And this setup is actually very beneficial in terms of developer experience because all the debugging works as you would expect. You can jump to the source directly within Visual Studio Code. So this is a nice setup, but from a build perspective, Webpack always still builds everything as is, as it would do with a normal Angular CLI application. So the issue here is that single monolithic Webpack build that we kind of need to tackle, and which at some scale might become a problem for you. So the solution again here is to split things up into smaller buckets, to parallelize those buckets, the execution of those buckets, and then basically just run what changed, and obviously being able to have some type of caching, such as the NX cache, to restore operations that we have already run and that we don't need to run it again. So one approach that we could do for that is incremental builds. So we could make every library that we have within our like setup buildable. And now the problem with that, let me jump back here a sec. Okay, the problem with that is that if we have a normal build, that is actually like super slow. Like in this case, you can see it's over 60 seconds. With a warm cache, meaning that we have already pre-cached like a lot of our libraries with that incremental building, we get some super fast speeds. However, when we have a cold cache, like meaning no results are cached at all, the speed might actually be lower. And so what is the reason? And the main reason for that is basically, let me actually just switch in here, because I think I cut out a couple of slides. Okay. So the main approach that we would do in that case is basically have those single libraries buildable, as I mentioned. So this can be achieved by NX buildable libraries. and it can check out in our doc. So everything would be buildable via an actual ng packager build and could then be cached. If we then run our top level application, it would actually pick up those caches from those libraries and directly reference the actual build artifact rather than actually running through it and building it every time again. The problem that is mentioned is potentially slow times when we basically have no cache at all. But even if we would create all those buildable libraries down here, the main problem that still persists is the actual linking time at the very top level of the application. And the problem there is that even though like we have all those artifacts, Webpack still needs to go through that and actually link those different artifacts together to create a final bundle. And if you have a large application, that may take quite a substantial amount of time. So again, the solution there is slice that as well into smaller pieces. And the first initial approach could be to just create different applications. But what we want to guarantee, however, is we want to still keep the same developer experience to be able to just run one application, but also get the benefits as if we would just serve a small slice of that application. And that is what we call, for instance, vertical slicing, because in this case, potentially what we could do is we could just load the parts that belong to that courses area, as in this case here, shown in the picture. And so all the team that just works on the courses area just loads that subset of the application. And similarly for the sales and also for the coupons areas. And Webpack Model Federation is actually one solution that we can apply to that and have it basically support us in that slicing aspect. Why is that? And the main reason is that Webpack allows us to, first of all, have those applications being served independently. So I could just load up the single one, but also load them in the context of the whole application. So I can still see my shop app with the top navigation bar, but have those single applications down there live individually. And so obviously in Nrwl, what we did is we looked into the problem and we tried to support developers with proper generators. So right now in Nrwl, you can already have a proper generator or a specific generator to set up such a module federation setup by using the Nrwl Angular host generator. And in our case, for instance, what we could do is generate a new shop application and specify immediately what would be those remote subset applications that we want to have, like sales, coupons, and courses. Many times, however, you are more in a situation where you have a large application and you want to actually break that up after the fact, right? So you already have that, you start loading up your application, it becomes slower, and then you want to cut it into smaller slices. So you can do that as well. You can migrate actually an existing application with that setup module federation generator, and then create individual remote sub-applications and refactor the logic into those. Again, the experience you would have at the end is exactly the same. So you have NX serve shop and basically just get the whole application as if you didn't change anything in the structure underneath, which is very important. So how does that help to speed up serve and build times? Well, the main reason is obviously caching. So with caching, we can actually just load a single application. So basically load all those applications, if they have been built before, from a cache, the actual build artifacts of those, and serve them statically, as if basically we have built it just now. Or we can also go and say, okay, we want to have actually, or we want to develop that coupons application. And so we dig into that single one and serve that up in as a development remote. And the main difference here is that when we serve things statically, we don't actually listen for changes in anything because they are just served out of a cache artifact. While if we specify applications as those dev remotes, we give actually Webpack the instruction to serve up a Webpack dev server. And so you get the same experience as you would get normally. But as you can already see, you don't serve or build or do anything with those applications up here, which are not part of your domain area, for instance, but they are getting served statically. So if you look again at a code example for that, and hopefully you can see my screen now, and let me know if it doesn't work. But this is basically the same setup, but now refactored into basically that module federation slices. And we can see that again by using graph, where it last time froze. So hopefully this time it works. And so what you can see here is you can see basically the structure of our workspace. We can actually exclude some of those end-to-end tasks because we're not really interested in that. So just makes a clear structure this way. And so you can now see the structure slightly changed. While before we had direct reference to like the checkout library and the orders library and the product catalog library, now we have such checkout remotes, which is an actual application in between. And the reason is now they are basically vertically split. So they are built independently as pieces, but still via that implicit reference that we specified in the NX configuration, we tell that they belong to the actual top level shop application. So how does it look like in the code? If we go here into our Visual Studio Code setup, we still have our shop app in here. It now has a couple of module federation specific configurations. So where we specify what are the remote applications. And these things are getting generated by the NX generator. So you can actually use those and then basically start digging deeper and understanding how those work. Following also our docs, which we have on nx.dev. The thing that is probably most interesting is how did our app module routing change? And it changed slightly in the sense that we still have the same routes because we still want to keep the same consistency as we had with the single application before. But now it doesn't load in the actual remote, the actual library lazily from the libs folder, but it rather actually builds that remote module from Webpack module federation. And for instance, if we take a look at the first one, the checkout module then has such a remote entry module. And so if you go up here, we see there's that remote entry module which got generated for us. And that one actually then has the lazy loading into that libs folder down there. So all we did is basically just move the lazy loading part out of the shop application such that it doesn't have a direct reference anymore, move it in one of those applications up there, and such that now we can have individual builds for all of those. What does it look if I want to serve the application? I just again do nx serve shop. You can now see in the actual terminal output that it now builds the checkout remote app first, then the product catalog app first, the orders remote, and then it loads up the actual application. And so if you go here on localhost 4200, you see still the product catalog, checkout, and orders page. So they work the same way as they did before. Interesting though, if we go for instance to 4101, we see that it also has in the background running our application for the checkout. So the single application there. And furthermore, if we run the builds again, you can see they are super fast because they get basically served out of the cache directly. And so that is the main reason why we want to have such a split up, and especially if you have a large application. Now, a lot of you might think, well, I don't really have such a huge application, so it's not really interesting for me. And you're actually right. Like you shouldn't go into that direction if you don't have the necessity to it just for the sake of splitting up. But what you might have is you might have at some point such a large application because as we mentioned, our architecture should kind of be flexible. So our business requirements might change. Our application might get larger than we initially expected. So we should be able to adapt over time to that. And this is an approach where you can go from that slow, large Angular app to a more split up, a more fine granular separate applications, and then leverage things like caching for speeding things up. So let's quickly recap. We went a bit through things like how do we split up things into smaller units via libraries, for instance, how that can help already with team allocation, how we can increment or basically optimize our CI time by only running what actually changed or using incremental builds for that. And finally, also how we can actually go to the top level application and also have the possibility to split up things there into different applications. The most important part, in my opinion, in the end is like the same developer experience should apply here. So we should still be able to just serve our application and not necessarily have to do a whole lot of other things just because we want to optimize speed or split up things into smaller sub pieces. And we also kind of saw how NX can guide us via generators along that journey. An important prerequisite of all that is obviously to have some type of caching in place. Otherwise, we cannot really restore anything that has been pre-computed or been already computed by some other teams from other domain areas. So we would be again at the same point where we need to build everything ourselves. And now in NX, you can use NX Cloud for that. It is our commercial add-on on top of the open source product NX. We come with a very generous 500 hours computation per month, which is usually more than enough than you need. For companies, we offer more like the private cloud direction, which allows you to host on-prem within your infrastructure. And that is then obviously like on payment. Since we had kind of a couple of hiccups during the talk, if you're interested in a full deep walkthrough, this video actually just got live an hour ago or 2 hours ago on our YouTube channel. So definitely go there and subscribe there. And there you can actually have a proper deep dive into how you start with an actual Angular application and slowly refactor that with mod federation to a more sliced application. So thanks a lot. Sorry for the freezes and hiccups and whatever we had on our live channel. Follow us on NX DevTools for more news about things like that. We have an email as well. You can reach out or follow me on Twitter, and feel free to ping me there with further questions. Thanks.
Cool. Thank you, Juri. And yeah, there's definitely a few questions in YouTube, so I know you're logged in and we'll be answering those. But thank you so much, Kamal, Jay, and Chris for having a few questions. And glad, Ken, that you enjoyed it. I hope I'm saying your name right. If I'm not, apologies. I'll go ahead and pass it off to Duncan now to get started. And super excited, Duncan. Everybody get ready because we're going to be linting everything that Duncan is doing. You have live linters for you.
No pressure.
No pressure.
Right, I'll just share my screen.
All right, there we go.
All right, good evening, everybody. Yes, so I'm going to be talking about Angular material, and in particular, sort of Angular material form fields. It's a component there that has an awful lot of benefits, and it's probably one of the most used ones, but one of the ones that has an awful lot of issues around sometimes, and probably doesn't get used as much as it should do. So I'm going to go through a sort of a demo on this, but some of the things in this sort of presentation we're going to be looking at is obviously what the map form field component is, what the map form component can do, what it supports, the styling for the form field, and the user appearances and what those options are. We're talking about floating labels, a required marker, setting up an appearance, and setting the floating labels and required markers globally, adding a prefix and suffix, hint labels, error messages, and we'll touch on sort of themes towards the end. So, try that up. What is a material form field? Well, a material form field is a component that is from the Angular material library, and we can wrap both native and Angular material components like input, text areas, selects, and mat selects. Let's sort of name a few. There are some components that don't work with it, like checkboxes, to name one. But we'll have a look at them as we go through. So what does it do once it's actually wrapped? Once you've wrapped a component around a map form field? The map form field applies, as I said, it applies common styles like the floating label, like hints and error messages, and we'll take a look through these. So let's get started with an example. So simple example. So I'm not typing everything. I've got these all shortcut. Okay. So this is a sample input. For most of these, I'm just using inputs. We use a few other components later on. So we have this map form field as the wrapper. We've set the appearance here to legacy, and we'll talk more about that in a bit. But in the middle there, we've just got an input there with a placeholder, and we've set that type to text. And I've just turned the autocomplete off for the inputs. The main point with this is the directive here, allow mat input. It allows us to sort of join the sort of connect to the input, so the angler material can actually sort of change the style on the input and stuff. And we can sort of see the effects of that in the browser at the top here. So the default in this case is legacy. So when we sort of then click into it, we get the name at the top, and we've got the normal sort of text box at the bottom there with an underline. Right, so that's the sort of a basic example of it. And we'll have a look at some of the other options now for the appearance. So we'll have, I'll just put these in first, and then I'll sort of talk through them once I've saved it. Do these. Right, so we go back up to the top. So the map form field, as I said, we've set the appearance here in this particular one to legacy. We've got a placeholder and the text, and we've got that mat input directive. So that's very similar to the simple example previous. Sort of moving on, we then have we set the appearance to standard. That's what is standard. Well, standard is a sort of an updated version of legacy, and as far as I'm aware, legacy and standard are technically sort of deprecated. But standard is a sort of an updated version of it for spacing and styling. And so it sort of more conforms to the fill and outline, which we'll see in a second. With putting a placeholder into a standard one, when we click in that, I think I've got my, yeah, I have. Let's just turn it off for a second. Refresh. All right. What's going on? Oh yeah, no, sorry, that's all right. Me, yeah. So. Yeah, so legacy, when you click into legacy, the floating label appears at the top on that. And then on standard, we don't, because we put the placeholder in there, it is just a normal placeholder, really. So, and as we type over it, it types out. And then we move on to fill. Can't quite see that, I don't think you can quite see that, but there is actually a background to fill on this. I'm not quite sure why it's not showing that, but there's a slightly different color on the background of that. And then outline obviously has the whole of the outline there with that. So they're the four standard appearances. And as I said, I think legacy and standard are technically sort of deprecated, and so fill and outline are the preferred options in that case. Right, I think I'll just 6. Remember the one. Nine. Right, so in this section, we've again sort of repeating this a little bit, but it's so as I said, the appearance here is legacy, and that gives us the default kind of thing that we've seen before. With standard now, with place when we've had placeholder in place, we just get the label in the text there. So what we can do now is we can actually, if we want to sort of replicate that sort of placeholder floating label, as it were, we need to use a matte label for standard fill and outline to give us the same result. We can still have a placeholder in there as well, but the placeholder will remain on the as a piece of text at the back. But to get the floating label, we need to have a matte label in place as well. And that's the same for fill and outline. So that gives us those options there. And then sort of moving on to these ones. So we can so one of the other options is we can actually set the floating label. So we can set floating label to be always, as shown by here. So where it's in this particular case, legacy, it's always floating. So before we even go into the text box, the label is floated to the top. And we can set that to on all of them. So the standard, fill, and outline have all got the floating label to the top there. The next ones. The other option is for auto, so it takes the default settings. So legacy is they're all at the so when we click into it, the floating label then goes to the top. So it's kind of the default section there, really. So legacy, standard, and fill and outline all sort of follow that same sort of format. So whatever the default is, then auto is that sort of setting. And moving on to this next one. Is floating label for never. Now, never only actually works for legacy. So in this case, setting the float label to never does what it says on the tin, so it doesn't float. The label just doesn't float. For standard, fill, and outline, it makes no difference at all. It is, as I said, it's not. It was only ever designed for the legacy format, so it just doesn't do anything for the other three types. So yeah. Not come across a good use of that myself, but I'm sure there's a requirement somewhere for it. And another option here is the setting of the required markers. So we can set them in here. So I've set these two up. So I've got both of an appearance of standard, and I've set it so that the second one's required, and the other one, so we can sort of see where the hide required marker is the property there. So that one's got the hide required marker set to true, so we can actually hide it, because in case we want to show or don't want to show the hide required. The required field, or we want another way of doing it, and we don't want the asterisk in the text box there. So we can actually hide that required marker, and I've just put it in the second one there just to sort of show where that would be and how that looks like. So we can actually hide that required marker. moving on to prefixes and suffixes. Let's put these in first so we can have a look. Right, so yes, on the prefix and suffix, we can actually add prefixes and suffixes, as the name would suggest. So in this case, we've got legacy appearance with our input there, and then basically what we've got is these couple of spans, and we've got a couple of directives on here that sort of specifies whether it prefixes it, so it puts it at the front, suffixes it, and puts it at the back. So we can use text, or we can, sort of moving on to this legacy one here, we can use icons, and we can sort of toggle the icon, so it's an I or a slash over the I. So we can sort of make the password visible. So we type in a password, and if we wanted to check it, we can make it visible, sort of thing. So that's that with the sort of using icons. We can do it on a mat select. I'll set a mat select up here. So we've got a couple of items in the mat select, and we've got a icon on the prefix, sorry, on the suffix. So we can just set that up on the suffix there. And the last one, with outline and fill text, that's just sort of a cautionary thing, really. Text just doesn't line up with outline and fill text boxes for form fields. As we can sort of see here, the outline just doesn't line up with the word prefix like it does in the legacy. And the reason being for that is the spacing's all set differently and everything like that. So if you're using prefixes or suffixes on fill or prefix on outline form fields, the thing there is to use icons because you just won't get the text to align on that at all. So yeah, so it's just one to bear in mind there. So moving over to hint messages. Usually have got the same sort of setup with the mat form field, with the mat label. But we've got this hint label. So the hint label is on the mat form field itself, in this case. And it's this top one here. And it will appear underneath underneath the input. Now, with the hint label, it can only be left aligned. So that's where we are with that. It's there. But it is limited in what you can do with that. The alternative is the mat hint element. We can set the mat hint element up, and then we can, as we've shown on the next two inputs, we can actually change the alignment so it's left or right, just by setting the align to end. Pushes the hint message to the right if that's the desired output. On that. I don't know if I did that one. That was 30, 31. No. We'll possibly come back to that. 31. Error messages. So setting up error messages, we can have the same sort of form field component. I'll just set this up with a form control, and setting up the mat error. So we have this mat error element, and then we can check to see whether, in this case, the name is valid or invalid, and then we can then display an error message. So if I don't put anything in there, we get the field is required in that respect. What I would say is if we have a hint message on that to start with, then the hint message is removed and the error message is put in place. So that's something there to bear in mind as well. And then sort of quite lastly, but we're getting there, we have a few theming options. It's 34. Got that one in twice somewhere. There should be another one in there somewhere. Maybe not. Okay. Yeah. With Angular material and theming, we have got 3 sort of kind of colors that we can set with that, and they are primary, which is the primary color, depending on, and this kind of depends on the theme that you may have applied when installing Angular material, or whether you've created a custom one for your own needs. So you set the color. The default is primary, but we can then change that to be legacy or warm, and by changing that to legacy, and so we get slightly different colors depending on the theme. So sort of worn is always red, and this particular color I think is sort of like a pink, depending on the as I said, depending on the theme that we had set when we installed Angular. One of the things I sort of touched on, so that's really sort of, sorry, that's really all the sort of to do with the theming that I was going to sort of touch upon in here, but we can sort of change that, and you can set up your own themes as well. One of the other bits I was going to just quickly show was and I sort of commented that out earlier on because I've left it set. If we've got a lot of input boxes or components in our forms, and we want to sort of change the style of the form, and then what we don't want to be doing is sort of going through every form and setting the appearance and whether we have the required marker there, or whether we have the floating label or what. So what we can do is, if I just go back to one of the earlier ones, and if I just take off the appearance off a couple of these, off of them 4, I'll just take it off of them. What we can do is we can actually set these globally. He says, hopefully. Yeah, so that is that the one? Yeah, so that should be set globally. Oh, it's set to fill, and we can't see fill very well. I'll change that to outline. Yeah, so that's better. So we can now sort of set these up, and we control these, so we can actually have the label in this case set to always, and if I'd set the required marker to be true, and I had set the field to be required. Right. Why is that not showing up now? My PC is playing up at the moment. But yeah, so we should be able to set up the four to set these up. We create, in this case, I've just created an options config object, and then we import the add the providers for the, and then it's this match form field default options, and then we just use our values from our config or our object here. Sort of point this out really because a colleague of mine actually went into quite a bit of detail and created a directive for this before he realized that you could actually set these globally. So it was just something I just sort of point out that we can actually do that. I'm not quite sure why it's not showing up the required marker on here, but yeah. So that is map form fields. That's sort of an introduction to map form fields, really.
Cool. That was awesome. There's a few questions in chat, which Duncan, you can answer via YouTube, but we are past time, and I know this is everybody's, like, especially in, Angular Mountain View and SF's lunchtime. So we'll let you all go. Thank you so much. Thank you, Juri, for answering those questions in YouTube as well. And glad you all found use of this. We'll be doing this every month as well. So we'll be inviting other Angular speakers over to Angular Mountain View, Angular San Francisco, GDG Silicon Valley, and Modern Web, kind of like the group of meetups in the Bay Area. So keep a lookout for those meetups. And we already have August planned, so we'll be posting that soon, and we're excited. So thank you so much, Juri and Duncan, and we'll see you all soon.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.